At 3:47 a.m. on October 14, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Harold Hank Brennan stood in the conning tower of the USS Corvina, watching the green phosphorescence of the Makassar Strait slide past the periscope lens. 31 years old, 8 months in command, 0 confirmed kills. The Corvina was a Gato-class submarine, 312 feet of welded steel, 4 diesel engines, 2 electric motors, and 24 torpedoes stored in racks fore and aft. She displaced 1,525 tons on the surface and could make 20 knots with her diesel screaming. Submerged, she was slower, barely 9 knots on battery power, but she could dive to 300 feet and stay there for 48 hours if the crew was disciplined and the air held out. On paper, the Corvina was one of the deadliest weapons in the Pacific Fleet, but paper doesn't account for the Mark 14 torpedo. The Bureau of Ordnance had been promising fixes for 18 months. The magnetic exploders that detonated prematurely, the contact exploders that crumpled on impact instead of firing, the depth-keeping mechanisms that sent torpedoes running 10 feet deeper than their settings. Every submarine captain in the Pacific had stories about perfect attacks ruined by defective fish. Brennan had more stories than most. He'd fired 18 torpedoes across 2 war patrols. 11 had run erratic, corkscrewing through the water or diving straight to the bottom. 4 had detonated prematurely, exploding harmlessly in the wake of their targets. 2 had struck a tanker square amidships at the perfect angle, and both had simply bounced off the hull without exploding, their contact exploders crushed by the force of their own impact. 1 had circled back toward the Corvina herself, its gyroscope malfunctioning, forcing an emergency dive that nearly killed half the crew when a ballast tank valve failed to open. 0 confirmed kills. The Navy didn't court-martial captains for faulty torpedoes. The brass knew the weapons were defective, knew it, and kept sending submarines out with them anyway, because there was a war on, and you fought with what you had. But they didn't promote captains who came back empty-handed either, and Brennan knew that Admiral Ralph Christie's staff in Fremantle was already whispering about him. Another skipper who couldn't produce. Another boat that came back with a full torpedo load and nothing to show for it. His executive officer, Lieutenant Tom Driscoll, climbed up through the hatch from the control room below. Driscoll was 26, a Naval Academy graduate with a thin mustache and an unshakable calm that Brennan had come to rely on during the long weeks at sea. Radar contact, Captain. Bearing 045, multiple targets, range approximately 18,000 yards. Brennan pulled back from the periscope and crossed to the small radar repeater mounted on the conning tower bulkhead. The SJ Surface Search Radar was one of the few pieces of equipment on the Corvina that actually worked the way it was supposed to. Green blips painted themselves across the screen, each one representing a ship on the dark ocean ahead. How many? 4 large targets in column, 2 smaller contacts flanking the formation. Speed approximately 11 knots, course 315. 4 merchants and 2 escorts, a convoy heading northwest along the Borneo coastline, probably bound for the oil refineries at Balikpapan or the airfields further up the coast. Brennan studied the radar picture. The escorts were positioned correctly, one ahead and to starboard of the convoy, one astern and to port. Standard Japanese defensive doctrine. They would be pinging with their sonar, listening for any sign of an American submarine lurking in the darkness. If even half of Brennan's torpedoes worked, this convoy could be his salvation. 2 ships, maybe 3. Enough to prove to Christie that he wasn't a failure. Enough to earn another patrol, another chance. Battle station's torpedo, he said quietly. Let's go hunting. If you're new to WW2 Tales, welcome. This channel covers the incredible true stories of ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances during the Second World War. We upload every week, so subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And stick around to the end of this video, because what happened over the next 37 hours would test every man aboard the Corvina to the absolute breaking point. The approach took nearly an hour. Brennan kept the Corvina on the surface, running at flank speed to get ahead of the convoy. The diesels hammered away, pushing the submarine through the dark water at 19 knots. On the bridge, lookouts swept the sky with binoculars, watching for Japanese patrols patrol aircraft that could end the attack before it began. At 4:22 a.m., with the convoy still 7 miles away, Brennan ordered the dive. "Clear the bridge! Dive! Dive!" The lookouts tumbled down through the hatch. The diesels choked and died as the main induction valve slammed shut. Ballast tanks flooded with a roar of rushing water, and the Corvina tilted forward, sliding beneath the waves. 55 feet, level off at periscope depth. The diving officer worked the controls, adjusting trim, bringing the submarine level. At 55 feet, the tip of the attack periscope just barely broke the surface, a slender tube of glass and steel that was almost invisible against the dark water. Brennan pressed his eye to the periscope and began to search. The convoy emerged from the darkness slowly, one ship at a time. First, the lead escort, a Chidori-class torpedo boat, small and fast, her sharp bow cutting through the swells. Then, the merchants, 3 cargo ships riding high in the water, their holds probably empty, returning to Japan for another load of war material. And finally, bringing up the rear, the prize, a tanker. She was huge, easily 10,000 tons, and riding low with a full load of oil. Her hull was painted black, and she sat in the water like a pregnant whale, slow and fat and vulnerable. Aviation fuel probably, or bunker oil for the Japanese fleet. Either way, she was worth more than the other 3 ships combined. Behind the tanker, the second escort prowled, another Chidori, identical to the first, her depth charge racks loaded and ready. Brennan made his calculations. The tanker was the target, but the escorts were the problem. A Chidori-class torpedo boat displaced about 800 tons, small by destroyer standards, but deadly enough. She carried 3 4.7-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and a full rack of depth charges. Her crew had been hunting American submarines for nearly 2 years, and the good captains had learned their trade. They knew how to read sonar. They knew how to anticipate a submarine's movements, and they knew how to drop their charges close enough to kill. The forward escort was 600 yards ahead of the convoy, zigging back and forth across the formation's path. The rear escort was 400 yards behind the tanker, holding steady on her port quarter. Brennan would have to slip between them. Torpedo room, make ready tubes 1 through 6, set depth at 10 feet, speed high. Tubes 1 through 6, ready, Captain. Depth 10 feet. Speed high. 10 feet was shallower than doctrine recommended. The Mark 14 ran deep, everyone knew that. So Brennan was compensating, trying to put his fish into the tanker's waterline instead of passing harmlessly beneath her keel. It might work, it might not. You never knew until you fired. Bearing Mark 043, range Mark 1,400 yards. Angle on the bow, port 15. Lieutenant Driscoll fed the data into the torpedo data computer, a mechanical calculator the size of a washing machine that computed firing solutions based on the target's bearing, range, speed, and course. The TDC clicked and whirred, its gears turning, and spit out an answer. Solution ready, Captain. Recommend firing bearing 041. Brennan took one last look through the periscope. The tanker was centered in his crosshairs, her hull a long black shadow against the pre-dawn sky. The forward escort had just completed a zig and was turning away. The rear escort was still 400 yards astern, too far to interfere. This was the moment. This was what everything came down to. Fire 1. The Corvina shuddered as compressed air blasted the first torpedo from its tube. Through the periscope, Brennan watched the wake streak toward the target, a thin white line cutting across the dark water. Fire 2! Another shudder. Another wake. Fire 3. Fire 4. 4. Mark 14 torpedoes, each one carrying 643 pounds of Torpex high explosive, racing toward the tanker at 46 knots. Fire 5. Fire 6. The last 2 fish leaped from their tubes and joined their brothers. 6 torpedoes in the water, 6 chances to finally score a kill. Brennan started counting. At 1,400 yards, running at high speed, impact should come in approximately 55 seconds. The control room was silent. Every man was listening, waiting, praying. 40 seconds, 50 seconds, 55 seconds, nothing. Brennan's stomach tightened. Not again. Please, God, not again. 60 seconds, 65, 70. And then, light. A flash of yellow-white fire erupted amidships on the tanker, followed a half-second later by the deep boom of the explosion transmitted through the water. Through the periscope, Brennan saw debris fountaining into the sky. Chunks of deck plating, shattered lifeboats, a human figure spinning end over end through the air. "Hit!" Driscoll shouted. "We got a hit!" Another flash, another boom. A second torpedo had struck, this one further aft, and now the tanker was burning along her entire length. Black smoke poured from her ruptured hull, and her stern was already settling as water flooded her engine room. 2 hits out of 6. The other 4 torpedoes had missed or malfunctioned, but 2 hits were enough. The tanker was dying. Brennan allowed himself a moment of savage satisfaction. After 8 months and 24 torpedoes, he finally had a kill. A real kill. Something he could take back to Christie and slam down on the desk like a trophy. Then the sonar operator's voice cut through the celebration. "High-speed screws bearing 175. Close aboard. One of the escorts is turning toward us." The rear escort, the Chidori that had been prowling behind the tanker. She'd seen the torpedo wakes, and now she was coming to kill the thing that had attacked her convoy. Brennan snapped the periscope handles up. "Take her down. Make your depth 200 feet. Rig for silent running. Rig for depth charge." The Corvina tilted sharply downward, her electric motors driving her into the darkness. Around the boat, men moved with practiced urgency, securing loose gear, shutting down unnecessary equipment, preparing for the hammering they all knew was coming. The first depth charges exploded at 5:31 a.m. There were 5 of them, dropped in a standard Japanese pattern, 1 in the center and 4 around it, designed to bracket a submarine's estimated position. The charges were set for 150 feet, and the Corvina was at 180 feet when they went off. The sound was indescribable. Not a boom, not a crash, but something in between, a physical force that slammed into the hull and shook the entire submarine like a dog shaking a rat. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. Men were thrown off their feet, grabbing for handholds, cursing and praying in the same breath. Brennan grabbed the periscope housing and held on as the deck bucked beneath him. The charges were close. Too close, but not close enough. Not yet. Damage report. Forward engine room reports a ruptured pipe fitting, water spraying across the compartment. After torpedo room reports the stern tube packing is leaking. Maneuvering room reports partial loss of hydraulic pressure. The Corvina was hurt, not fatally, not yet, but she was bleeding, and the hunters above could sense that blood in the water. Can we control the flooding? Forward engine room says yes. They're on it. Stern tube? It's a slow leak. Manageable for now. Hydraulics? We've got manual backup. Controls are sluggish but functional. Brennan nodded. The damage was bad, but the boat was still fighting, still alive. All ahead 1/3. Come left to 270. Make your depth 250 feet. He was trying to slip away beneath the thermal layer, a boundary between warmer surface water and colder deep water that could reflect and distort sonar pulses. Every submarine captain knew about thermal layers. The problem was, every good escort captain knew about them too. The Chidori circled overhead, her sonar pinging methodically into the depths. Ping, ping, ping. At 5:48 a.m., the second depth charge pattern came down. This time, the Japanese had adjusted their settings. The charges exploded at 190 feet, barely 40 feet above the Corvina's conning tower. The submarine was lifted bodily by the pressure wave, then slammed back down as the water collapsed around her. The lights went out. Emergency lanterns flickered on, casting the control room in a dim red glow that made every man look like he was already dead. "Bow planes are jammed!" the diving officer shouted. "They're stuck on full dive. We're passing 260 feet, 270. She's not responding." The Corvina was plunging toward the bottom, her jammed bow planes dragging her down into the crushing depths. At 300 feet, the hull would start to groan. At 400 feet, rivets would pop and seams would split. At 500 feet, the ocean would come crashing in, and 63 men would die in the darkness. All back emergency, blow forward ballast. The electric motors screamed into reverse. High-pressure air roared into the forward ballast tanks, fighting the submarine's downward momentum. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The Corvina just kept sinking, her depth gauge spinning toward doom. 280 feet, 290 feet, 300 feet. And then, slowly, agonizingly, the descent began to slow. The needle on the depth gauge quivered, hesitated, stopped. 312 feet. The Corvina hung there, trembling, her hull creaking under the pressure. 12 feet beyond her rated maximum depth. 12 feet from the point where steel would fail and water would win. "She's holding," the diving officer whispered. "She's holding." Brennan let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. They were alive, for now. "Shift bow planes to manual control. Get me some men on the hydraulic system. I need those planes working." "Aye, Captain." But even as the crew scrambled to make repairs, Brennan knew the real problem wasn't mechanical. The real problem was circling overhead, pinging, waiting. The Chidori wasn't going anywhere, and at 5:52 a.m., her sister joined the hunt. The second escort had left the convoy, left the surviving merchants to fend for themselves, and come to help with the kill. Now there were 2 sets of screws overhead, 2 sonar sets pinging, 2 ships full of depth charges waiting to fall. Brennan looked around the control room. His men were scared. He could see it in their eyes, but they were holding together. They trusted him to get them out of this. The question was whether he deserved that trust. "Sonar, what are they doing?" "They've established a search pattern, Captain. One ship circles while the other holds position. They're taking turns pinging." Classic Japanese tactics. One escort would circle, narrowing down the submarine's position, while the other waited directly overhead to attack the moment they had a fix. It was patient, methodical, and almost impossible to evade. "They're not going away, are they?" "No, Captain, I don't think they are." Brennan closed his eyes and thought about his options. He could try to run. The Corvina could make 4 knots on her electric motors without making enough noise to be easily detected. But the escorts were faster, much faster, and they had sonar. The moment he tried to slip away, they would hear him and be on top of him in minutes. He could try to fight. A submarine carried no weapons that could hurt a surface ship while submerged, but if he surfaced, he could use his deck gun, a 3-inch gun against 2 Chidoris with 4.7-inch guns and torpedo tubes. Suicide. He could try to wait. The Corvina could stay submerged for 48 hours on her batteries, but the escorts could wait too. They had food, fuel, and fresh air. All the Corvina had was a slowly draining battery and a slowly poisoning atmosphere. There was no good option. There was no clever trick. There was only death, coming for him in 3 different forms, and no way to escape any of them. Unless... Brennan opened his eyes. "Tom," he said quietly, "what do the Japanese know about us right now?" Driscoll frowned. "They know we're down here somewhere. They know approximately where, but not exactly. That's why they're pinging." "What else?" "They know we're damaged. The leaking oil, maybe. Or the noise we made when the bow planes jammed." "So, they know we're hurt. They know we're trapped. What do they expect us to do?" Driscoll thought about it. "They expect us to try to escape, to run for it as soon as we think we have an opening." "Exactly. They're waiting for us to move. Every escort captain in the Japanese Navy has been trained to wait for the submarine to make a mistake, to be patient, to let the prey exhaust itself." "So what do we do?" Brennan smiled grimly. "We give them what they want. We make them think we've already exhausted ourselves. We make them think we're dead." The plan was insane. It violated every principle of submarine warfare, every instinct of self-preservation, every lesson Brennan had learned in 15 years of naval service. But it was also the only plan that might work. The Japanese were hunting by sound. Their sonar was pinging, and their hydrophone operators were listening for any noise that would betray the Corvina's position. The hum of electric motors, the whir of ventilation fans, the clunk of a dropped wrench. As long as the submarine made noise, they could track her. As long as they could track her, they could kill her. But what if she stopped making noise entirely, not just went quiet, not just rigged for silent running, but stopped, completely, as if she'd been destroyed by the last pattern of depth charges and was now sinking toward the bottom in pieces? "All stop," Brennan ordered. "Secure all machinery. Everything, and I mean everything. Motors, fans, pumps, refrigeration, trim, life support. Shut it all down." The control room went silent. Driscoll stared at him. "Captain, without life support, I know what we'll do, Tom. We'll start dying, very slowly. But the Japanese don't know how slowly, and if they think we're already dead, they might just leave us alone long enough to save ourselves. And if they don't leave, then we die a little faster than we would have anyway. It wasn't an inspiring speech. It wasn't meant to be. It was the truth, laid out plain and ugly, and every man in the control room understood it. One by one, the machines fell silent. The electric motors stopped first, their hum fading to nothing. Then the ventilation fans, leaving the air still and thick. The refrigeration unit, the hydraulic pumps, the trim pump, the carbon dioxide scrubbers. Last of all, the lights. Brennan ordered the emergency lanterns extinguished. The Corvina was plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that pressed against your eyes, that made you wonder if you'd gone blind, that seemed to have weight and substance. In the silence, Brennan could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear the hull creaking under the pressure of 312 feet of water. He could hear the distant ping of Japanese sonar, probing the depths like the finger of God. Ping, ping, ping. And then, very faintly, he heard something else. Screws. The escorts were moving, circling, searching for the submarine that had suddenly gone silent. Brennan held his breath and waited. The mathematics of suffocation are coldly precise. A human being at rest consumes approximately 0.5 liters of oxygen per minute and exhales approximately 200 milliliters of carbon dioxide. In a sealed space, this means the oxygen gradually depletes while the carbon dioxide gradually accumulates. The Corvina's interior volume was approximately 35,000 cubic feet. With 63 men aboard, the CO2 concentration would rise by roughly 0.2% per hour. At 2%, men would begin to feel uncomfortable, mild headaches, a sense of stuffiness. At 3%, the headaches would become severe. Breathing would become labored. Thinking would become difficult. At 4%, confusion would set in. Men would have trouble following simple instructions. Some would become irrational, aggressive, paranoid. At 5%, most men would lose consciousness. At 6%, they would die. Brennan had done the calculations in his head while standing in the darkness of the control room. At the current rate of accumulation, they had approximately 15 hours before the CO2 reached lethal levels. Maybe 16 if they could keep the men calm and still, minimizing their oxygen consumption. 15 hours. That was how long the Japanese had to give up and go home. The first 2 hours were the easiest. The escorts circled overhead, pinging, searching, dropping occasional patterns of depth charges into areas where they thought the submarine might be hiding. But the charges fell farther and farther from the Corvina's actual position. The Japanese were guessing now, not targeting. They knew she was down there somewhere, but they didn't know exactly where. At 7:15 a.m., the sonar operator whispered that both escorts had moved off to the south, probably searching the area where the Corvina had first been detected. The pinging grew fainter. The screws grew distant. For a moment, Brennan allowed himself to hope. Then the escorts came back. At 8:30 a.m., the CO2 concentration reached 2.5%. Men were starting to feel it now. The air had a thickness to it, a staleness that made every breath feel inadequate. Headaches were spreading through the crew, dull, throbbing pains that no amount of aspirin could touch. Brennan had ordered the crew to lie down in their bunks, to remain as still as possible, to sleep if they could. Moving around consumed oxygen. Talking consumed oxygen. Panicking definitely consumed oxygen. The only way to stretch their 15 hours was to pretend they were already dead. 63 men lay in the darkness, breathing slowly, waiting to see if they would live or die. By 10 a.m., the temperature inside the submarine had risen to 105 degrees. Without the air conditioning running, the heat generated by 63 human bodies had nowhere to go. It accumulated in the sealed steel tube, cooking the men inside like meat in a slow oven. Sweat poured off every man aboard. The humidity climbed towards saturation. Condensation formed on the steel bulkheads, dripping down the walls in rivulets that looked disturbingly like blood in the darkness. Men stripped off their uniforms. Shirts first, then pants, then underwear. Modesty was a luxury they couldn't afford. Cooling was survival. Some men pressed themselves against the hull, seeking the relative coolness of the steel. Others lay in pools of their own sweat, too exhausted to move. A few had discovered that the torpedo tubes, with their thicker steel and greater surface area, were slightly cooler than the rest of the boat, and had crawled inside to escape the heat. Brennan moved through the boat in the darkness, speaking softly to his men, checking on their condition, trying to keep them calm. He could feel the heat sapping his own strength, feel the thick air dragging at his lungs, but he kept moving. If the captain stopped, the crew would stop, and if the crew stopped, they would die. "How are you holding up, son?" "I'm okay, Captain. It's just hard to breathe." "I know. It'll get easier. Just stay still and rest." He said the same thing to every man he passed. It was a lie. The breathing would get harder, not easier. But it was a necessary lie. Hope was the only thing keeping these men alive. By 11:30 a.m., the CO2 concentration had reached 3.4%. Men were starting to lose their grip on reality. The combination of heat, humidity, darkness, and carbon dioxide was producing a kind of waking delirium, hallucinations, confusion, irrational fears. One sailor in the forward torpedo room became convinced that the Japanese had already boarded the submarine and were coming to kill them. He tried to arm a torpedo to use as a last defense. It took 3 men to restrain him and convince him that the threat wasn't real. Another man in the engine room began crying uncontrollably, sobbing that he would never see his mother again. His shipmate sat with him in the darkness, holding his hands, telling him it would be okay. A third man simply stopped responding. He lay in his bunk, eyes open, staring at nothing, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. When Brennan tried to speak to him, he didn't seem to hear. The crew was breaking. At 1 p.m., the CO2 reached 4.1%. Brennan himself was feeling the effects now. His thoughts were slow, sluggish, like trying to run through waist-deep water. He had to concentrate to remember what he was doing, where he was going, why any of this mattered. The escorts were still overhead. He could hear them through the hull, even without sonar. The faint throb of their engines, the occasional ping of their sonar. They were still hunting, still waiting. How long had it been? Brennan tried to calculate. The attack had happened at 5:15 a.m. It was now 1 p.m. That was almost 8 hours. 8 hours of hiding in the darkness, breathing poison air, waiting for the Japanese to give up or for his crew to die. He wasn't sure which would happen first. At 2:17 p.m., a voice spoke in the darkness. "Captain?" It was the sonar operator. His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but there was something different in it, something that sounded almost like hope. "What is it?" "The screws. The high-speed screws. They're moving away. Both of them. They're heading north." Brennan felt his heart lurch. "Are you sure?" "Yes, sir. I can barely hear them now. They're definitely leaving." Leaving. After 8.5 hours of circling, pinging, waiting, the Japanese were finally giving up. They must have decided the Corvina was destroyed, must have decided there was no point in waiting any longer for wreckage that was never going to surface. They were leaving. Brennan wanted to shout, wanted to laugh, wanted to restart the engines and blow to the surface and breathe real air again, but he didn't. He couldn't. This could be a trick, a Japanese tactic to lure the submarine into revealing herself. "Keep listening," he whispered. "Tell me if they come back." An hour passed. 2 hours. 3. The escorts did not return. At 5:30 p.m., more than 12 hours after the attack, more than 9 hours after Brennan had shut down life support, he finally gave the order. "Restart the scrubbers. Restart ventilation. Get us some air." The machines coughed back to life. Fans began to turn. The CO2 scrubbers wheezed and rattled, pulling poison from the atmosphere and replacing it with something almost breathable. Men who had been unconscious gasped and stirred. Men who had been delirious blinked and looked around in confusion. The crisis wasn't over, not yet, but the dying had stopped. The Corvina was alive. At 7:45 p.m., as darkness fell over the Makassar Strait, Brennan ordered the submarine to surface. She came up slowly, cautiously, her damaged systems struggling to complete the evolution. When the conning tower finally broke through into the night air, Brennan climbed up through the hatch and stood on the bridge, breathing deeply, letting the cool, tropical breeze wash over him. The sky was full of stars. The sea was empty. The Japanese were gone. Behind him, he heard the diesels rumbling to life as fresh air flooded through the boat. He heard men shouting, cheering, weeping with relief. He heard the sounds of survival. They had made it, but they weren't home yet. The Corvina's damage was extensive. The bow planes were still jammed in manual control. The stern tube packing was still leaking. A dozen other systems were operating on prayers and improvisation. Brennan radioed Fremantle with a damage report and a request for immediate return to base. The response was brief. Permission granted. Best possible speed. Good luck. The journey home took 6 days. The Corvina limped southwest at reduced speed, diving only when absolutely necessary to avoid Japanese patrol aircraft. 3 times, enemy planes forced her under, and each time Brennan wondered if this would be the dive she didn't come back from. But she kept coming back. On October 20th, 1943, the USS Corvina entered Fremantle Harbor. She was listing slightly to port, trailing oil, and looked like she'd spent a week in hell, which, in a sense, she had. Admiral Ralph Christie met Brennan on the pier. Christie was a controversial figure in the submarine force. Some men loved him. Others blamed him for the torpedo problems that had plagued the Pacific Fleet for 2 years. But he was also the man who decided which captains got promoted and which ones got sent home in disgrace. Christie looked at the battered submarine. He looked at the exhausted captain. Then he shook his head slowly. "I read your report," Christie said. "Playing dead for 9 hours. Shutting down life support. Letting your CO2 climb to 4%. That's either the bravest thing I've ever heard of or the most reckless." "Which is it, Admiral?" Christie almost smiled. "I suppose that depends on whether you're standing here talking to me or lying on the bottom of the Makassar Strait. Since you seem to be alive, I'll call it brave." The story of the Corvina's dead ship escape spread quickly through the submarine force. Other captains studied it, debated it, filed it away for future reference. Some thought Brennan was a tactical genius. Others thought he was the luckiest fool in the Pacific. But everyone agreed on one thing. Harold Brennan had found a way to survive when every other option was gone. He had bet his life, and the lives of 62 other men, on his understanding of how the enemy thought. He had played dead so convincingly that the Japanese had given up and gone home, and he had won. The Corvina was repaired over the following 6 weeks. New bow plane hydraulics, new stern tube packing, new everything that had been broken or damaged in those desperate hours beneath the Makassar Strait. When she sailed again in December 1943, she carried a new weapon, the Mark 18 electric torpedo. No wake, no erratic runs, no premature detonations. Finally, after 2 years of failure, the submarine force had a weapon that actually worked. On her 4th war patrol, Brennan put 4 Mark 18 into a Japanese troop transport. All 4 detonated. The transport sank in under 3 minutes. On her 5th patrol, he caught a tanker convoy off Mindanao and sank 2 ships in a single night attack. On her 6th, he added a destroyer to his total, a Fubuki class, 2,000 tons, caught at dawn while escorting a damaged cruiser. By the end of the war, the USS Corvina had sunk 9 Japanese ships totaling 47,000 tons. She earned 3 battle stars, a Navy unit commendation, and a reputation as one of the most effective boats in the 7th Fleet. But the patrol that made her famous was still the 3rd one, the one where she didn't sink anything at all, the one where her captain kept her alive by pretending she was dead. Harold Brennan was promoted to commander after the Corvina's 6th patrol. He went on to command a submarine division, then a squadron. He served in Korea, in the early Cold War, in a dozen postings that the Navy considered important. He retired in 1958 as a captain. He never got his admiral's stars. The Navy had a long memory, and there were always whispers about the Corvina's first 2 patrols, the empty patrols, the failed patrols, the patrols before the torpedoes started working. Some officers never forgave him for coming back without kills, even though the kills had been impossible to get. Brennan didn't seem to mind. He settled in San Diego, bought a small sailboat, and spent his retirement teaching children how to sail. He was patient with them, encouraging, never raised his voice. He seemed like the gentlest man in the world. He never talked about the war unless someone asked, and even then, he kept it brief. He'd mention the ships he sank, the battles he fought, the men who served under him. He made it sound almost routine, almost ordinary, as if anyone could have done what he did. He never talked about the 9 hours at 312 feet, never talked about the darkness, the heat, the poison air, never talked about the moment when he realized his plan might not work, when he understood that he might have just condemned 63 men to die in a steel coffin at the bottom of the Makassar Strait. Some things you don't talk about, you just survive them. Harold Brennan died in 1987 at the age of 75. His obituary mentioned his Navy Cross, his submarine commands, his contribution to tactical doctrine. It didn't mention the 9 hours, but the men who served with him remembered. At the memorial service, one of them, a former torpedo man named Wilson, now 70 years old himself, stood up to speak. He talked about the heat and the darkness and the fear. He talked about lying in his bunk, certain he was going to die, feeling his thoughts slip away as the carbon dioxide built up in his blood. And then, he talked about hearing the captain's voice in the darkness, calm, steady, almost gentle, telling him to hold on, telling him it would be okay, telling him they were going to make it. "I believed him," Wilson said. "We all believed him. That's why we're still here." The service ended with the Navy hymn. The mourners filed out into the San Diego sunshine. The sailboat in the harbor rocked gently at its mooring, waiting for a captain who would never return. And somewhere in the archives, in a dusty file marked USS Corvina, SS-226, Third War Patrol, a young historian would one day find the report that told the whole story. The attack, the depth charges, the 9 hours of silence, the dead ship trick that saved 63 lives. In the decades that followed, naval tacticians would study what Brennan did that night in the Makassar Strait. They gave it various names: silent ship doctrine, passive survival tactics, psychological warfare through inaction. They wrote papers about it, taught classes about it, incorporated it into training manuals that would be used for generations. But the men who lived through it had a simpler name for what happened. They called it the night they died and came back, because that's what it felt like. Lying in the darkness, breathing poison, feeling your mind slip away. That wasn't survival. That was death. Stretched out over 9 hours, experienced one breath at a time. The fact that they woke up afterward, that the diesel started and the fresh air came flooding in, that the stars were waiting for them when they finally surfaced, that felt like resurrection. Some of them never fully recovered. Not physically, the Navy doctors cleared them all for duty within a few weeks, but somewhere deeper. They had nightmares for years afterward. They couldn't sleep in enclosed spaces. They flinched at the sound of sonar pings in training exercises, even when they knew the pings were friendly. Others came out of it stronger. They had faced the absolute worst thing that could happen to a submariner, trapped at depth with no hope of escape, and they had survived. After that, nothing else seemed quite as frightening. They became the calmest men in any crisis, the ones who never panicked, the ones who always found a way. Brennan himself never talked about what it had cost him, but his wife noticed that he never slept with the bedroom door closed after the war, and on hot summer nights, when the San Diego air turned thick and still, he would sometimes get up and walk to the harbor and stand on the pier, breathing the salt air, watching the stars wheel overhead, just breathing, just remembering that he could. The USS Corvina herself had a shorter story. She completed 9 war patrols, sank her 9 ships, earned her battle stars and her commendation. After the war, she was decommissioned and placed in reserve. In 1969, she was struck from the Naval Register and sold for scrap. But before the cutting torches did their work, a group of her former crewmen made a pilgrimage to the shipyard where she lay. They walked through her empty compartments one last time. The control room where Brennan had given his impossible orders. The torpedo rooms where men had lain in the darkness waiting to die. The engine rooms where the diesels had finally roared back to life. They didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. They just touched the steel and remembered. If you want to see more stories like this, check out one of these videos here. We'll see you next time.